Every year on the grounds that I hunt on public land in Pennsylvania, a magical thing happens about October 20th, and it's pretty consistently that date, October 20th. Rubs start opening up at an exponential rate, so do scrapes. They're much more frequented by bucks, and the bucks themselves start to lose their shyness, even mature ones. And so this time frame from October 20th till about November 15th is what I call the primo time to hunt a rut buck. November 15th is usually the lockdown phase of the rut. That means that if a buck is able to be with a doe that's in heat, he's with a doe at that time. He's actually breeding. And so that's actually not the best of the time to actually be hunting, because they're often occupied unless you actually can find a buck and a doe together. That time frame leading up to November 15th, what I would say from October 20th to November 10th, is my favorite time when it comes to rut hunting. And since we have archery season during that time, it's an extra special time to be out in the woods. A lot of times bucks will actually move their main bed location from wherever it normally is to a new location closer to the vicinity of does, and especially doe family groups and their bedding areas. And that's the case in the scenario that I'm going to share with you today of this mature buck bed. It's a swamp setting, it takes place on an island. I'll show you what it looks like. So right here in the center is a buck bed, and I am on just a tiny little island. You can see the daylight all out around here. It's probably 35 yards at the most down to the long end. You can see the other side here's not more than 10 yards away. Perfect spot for them to hide. All right, let's put this rut buck bed into proper context. Here is an aerial map of the location of the buck bed I just showed you in the video. The red X is obviously the spot that this buck bed is located. And I want to just show you the hard transitions first. That is the areas where you go from, like over here, you go from woods right into swamp. And literally it's like 1 or 2 steps and you go from dry ground to wet. And then in here is obviously a really main central feature to this buck bed, and it's a swamp island. And it is a small island. I think I mentioned in the video that it's only about 30 yards wide or so. It's made up mostly of conifer trees, and so you can actually see from one end of the island to the other when you're actually in the island once you step into the conifer trees. And with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 places, it's just open. Those conifers are so dense that sunlight can't hit the forest floor and there's nothing growing in there. So this is literally just a traversing place for the deer. They just travel through here. They don't even stop to eat. But there are some important things that go on this island. Let me also show you the internal transition lines, and these are the more subtle transitions. That is dry ground usually, but it can get flooded if you get a big rain event. And you'll see what I mean when I draw it in here. The first one starts about in here, and it actually comes down here. And you can see this outline comes up into here, and then if I come over here, the soft transition comes down here and incorporates those couple of trees, and then it goes off the map. There's another one down here in the southwest corner, and there's another soft transition right here. And these are really critical because within these areas of the swamp where you have soft transition bumping up against hard transition, and then wet areas adjacent to it. This is where almost all of the deer live, and it's especially where the big bucks are. This area is really quite wet. You can see some of the main streams that flow through here. They mostly move from north to south, but because it's mostly flat land, they kind of wiggle around too. And over here on the east side, there's a stream that comes down along here. So you can see water pretty much surrounds this island, and it's one of the reasons why I've never seen a hunter on this island, even though it's not miles back into a swamp. It's a little trek, but it's not way out there. So to help this make sense for you, I want to draw in a spot right here in the center. And that area right there is where a couple of years ago I placed a trail camera. And the reason I placed it there, and I left it go for a year and had it on video mode, I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about this area and how deer were using it. And it was a fascinating study into deer behavior. What I didn't realize is that I was really fortunate, because right here, I mean, literally 10 yards, maybe 15 yards away from my trail camera was a scrape that was used year-round by does and bucks, although bucks didn't use the island during, most of the year. It was mostly during the rut that they showed up. But there was this main social hub right here in this little spot, and my camera was watching every moment to see what took place. And oftentimes you'll watch, I'll just draw you the main highway through here. It goes up into the woods, but it crosses the creek right in that area, and then it comes across right adjacent to the scrape and right past my camera, comes down through here, and then you can probably see visibly right where I'm drawing now, there's some deer trails there. And then it goes over here, and off the map is another wooded area as on this side. And so I watched through fawning season and the heart of the summer, mostly does, and later as they start venturing out with their fawns, the doe groups start coming back together. So you see groups of does moving through this area, and lesser bucks. And very occasionally, usually at night, a bigger racked buck. But for the most part, not a lot of buck action on this island. And as I mentioned, lots of times the does will be traveling through here. They stop right here at this scrape and they rub up against the dead hemlock branches. You know how the hemlocks are. They hold their dead branches really well. They just rub their eyes or their nose or their forehead against those branches. And it's obvious that they're communicating with one another. They're checking out who's been there, and they're also leaving their scent behind. Just like in the buck world, where there's a hierarchy, there are hierarchies in the doe world as well. They're just oftentimes much more subtle because we don't see the extreme aggressive behavior like bucks locking antlers and going to battle during mating season. So I got to watch this take place, and what was pretty interesting is that up until about September 20th or 25th, very rarely do I have a racked buck on this trail camera crossing this island. But then September 20th, September 25th, all the bucks have shed their velvet at that point. I start noticing this travel pattern of bucks coming down from the north or coming up from the south and traversing the island. And it's slow at first. Mostly at nighttime you start seeing some big racked bucks. And then as you enter into October and hunting season, there are more of them, but still not anything to get really excited about. And about October 20th, all of a sudden the bucks show up in force. And that's when this buck bed on this island starts getting used about October 20th, and it gets used by a lot of different bucks. I want to show you an area right adjacent to this buck bed. It's right here, and I wish I would have gotten this on video, but I don't dare go into this spot late July. I don't want to mess it up for the hunting season. This brown area here has a lot of conifer trees growing in it, very small ones, and almost every single one of them, I'm not sure if I could find a single hemlock that doesn't have a rub on it. And a lot of the trees every single year get killed because they're rubbed so much that they die. And I don't think it's coincidence that these rubs take place adjacent to not only this mature buck bed, but also the scrape that's right here, and everything else that's going on in this soft transition area around the island. One year I went through this soft transition semi-meticulously. I didn't cover every square foot, obviously, but I walked a lot of trails and I wanted to really understand what was going on. And what I came to realize is there's a buck bed here, there's a buck bed here, there's a buck bed up here, there's a buck bed down here. There's several off the screen south of this location and also over on this finger. You notice this finger that comes out. It's not noticeable for a lot of people, but it's pretty clear when you get to the water's edge and the spots where they're not willing to bed anymore because they'll get wet. And in cold weather, they'll die of hypothermia bedded down in that water. So there's buck beds in those locations, and then there's also buck beds up here in the northern part. There's, I think, 2 in this area right here that I just marked, and maybe 1 right here. This is a big tree right here. And there's 2 single big trees down here, another one up here. And other than that, except for the island, this is, for the most part, there are a couple of spots where you can actually shoot, and I'll point that out later during how I hunt this area. But otherwise, this is red dogwood and high bush blueberry and buttonbush and other water-loving shrubs. And it is so dense in a lot of places that you can't even shoot 3 yards, let alone 20. So there's no place to actually set up in this soft transition, save one spot that I feel like I can get into and not ruin any of the bedding and any of the buck action. What I think is happening is as the rut starts to heat up, you know, as we enter the end of October, these buck beds move up a little bit further toward the island. And in some cases, they're just bucks out on the fingers that are pushing up into other buck beds. And they position themselves in these spots because they want to be able to scent check does. And that's because if I draw on the doe bedding areas here, there's one right in this area right here. There's one down here. There is a doe bedding area in here. And there's a doe bedding area in here. Then if we go away from the island, there's a definite doe bedding area over here. And also one up in here. Now, of course, does can bed anywhere, but in general, that's the biggest concentration of doe beds. And so you see why these bucks are moving closer into these areas by the island. And this buck bed that I showed you, I believe, is something that's being replicated multiple times in relationship to this island. It just so happens that there's these 2 or 3 logs right here that create enough cover for a mature buck to feel comfortable. If you looked at the video close enough, you can actually probably see that the buck in 1 or 2 steps can jump up from his bed and actually be in the water here, in the really thick stuff. And that's the reason why I think he feels comfortable here. But almost all of the island, there's one spot up here that is an exception. The rest of the island is open. And this, I think, is being replicated out here in other places in this soft transition. The problem, as I said before, is how in the world do you hunt that soft transition? There's only one spot that I've found that I actually can shoot in, and that's both archery and rifle. It's that dense. Now, before I jump into showing you 3 ways that I hunt this particular area, I want to emphasize something here. Most of the food source, ag-related food source, is to the west. So you see a lot of movement at night from the east to the west, and you see a lot of movement in the morning from the west back to the east. And while bucks often travel this north-south route, they're island hopping, really, because there are a couple of other islands north and south of this island. And I think they're just cruising through, checking for hot does, scent checking in the rut. They do obviously follow this main trail east and west, but man, it is really significant how many more does are on this east-west route and how many more bucks are on the north and south route compared to the other way around. So obviously, if you have a hot doe, you're going to have bucks trailing her. And there's nothing that says this is the buck highway and this is the doe highway. I'm just using information from 1 year worth of video that tells me if something's coming down the north-south trail, it's pretty good. There's a pretty good chance that it's going to be a buck. And if it's coming from the east or the west, pretty good chance it's a doe or a fawn. All right, so let me show you a couple of ways that I would go about hunting this specific spot. And in doing so, I'm going to force myself to hunt it on a southwest wind because that's the most common wind that we have in the time period from October 20th to November 10th, which is the peak of the rut where I live. Now you'll have to adjust that time based upon where you live and your experiences, but I mean, it is really replicated year after year. I've noticed those 20 days are key for big buck movement. By November 15th, and Pennsylvania's Game Commission, I believe, or maybe it was Penn State, did a study on this. That's the peak, November 15th in this area. That's the peak of when does are being bred. And so obviously when the actual height of breeding takes place, the most bucks are tied up with the most does, you see the least amount of action during the rut. So by November 15th, a lot of times that's like the heart of the lockdown. And prior to that, I've had a lot of really good success. October 20s, November single digits right up till about the 10th. And you'll obviously have action after that as well, but it's more hit and miss. So I'm going to force myself to be on a southwest wind, and I'd actually probably prefer to hunt this on an east wind because there's usually a front associated with that, or some other wind that if I've got intel on a specific buck. But for these 3 illustrations, I'm going to show you how I hunt it on a southwest wind. The first one is really kind of basic. I come in from the east. I try to stay as perpendicular to my location as possible, coming straight in, and I actually will set up right here on the transition. First tree on the island, and I can get into that quietly. And the reason I choose this spot is right here in this area, there's a little bit of a blowdown. And also the vegetation seems to come in to this island a little bit more than any other spot on the island. And now there are a couple of deciduous trees here that may have something to do with that. But it's one of the few places where I feel like I can come right to the edge of the island, quietly put my stand up, and go up my steps to my tree stand without a buck, even just 25 yards away, detecting me. I know for a lot of people that probably sounds crazy, But there is a main way to get in here. It's natural. It was not cut out. I don't do any cutting on public land. It's illegal in my state and in most states. But there's a way to get through here, and I take full advantage of it. The mistake that I made the first year that I discovered this bed is I went in, it was either the opening day or the day after the opening day. And that was too early for bucks. I think I saw a dink buck, but there's nothing mature really during daylight traversing this island, at least not on a regular basis in early October. And so I went in early. And the reason that that's a bad thing is that the more I come into this spot, the more the deer get educated of my presence. I leave my scent behind. They know that I'm there, even if they don't encounter me while I'm actually there. My scent's left behind, and that pressures them. So I want to take advantage of the best time to come in. So my first scenario here is to come in October 20th, or whenever the best weather is between October 20th and maybe October 25th, set up in this tree. And I actually don't go very high. I'm only up 8 or 10 feet off the ground, but it's enough because I'm not silhouetted. It's enough to be up off the ground, but I can still see if a buck gets up out of this bed. I can see him if he takes a step or two over here to the west. And that gives me a 25-yard shot at that buck. I also have the opportunity, if there's any wanderers that early, which sometimes there are, to have a pretty easy chip shot of about 15 yards. So that's the first scenario that I would hunt. I know it's very elementary and straightforward, but sometimes we overthink things, I think. And what I like about this is I don't have to go through any main bedding areas. All the doe areas are here to the south of me and to the west. The wind is blowing my scent back up into the woods. All the bucks tend to congregate on this side and down here south of the island. And so I'm not messing up a lot by doing this. I will go in one time and one time only between October 20th and 25th. If the weather's not right, I won't go in at all. All right, so the second scenario is almost identical to the first one. I come in just about the same path. The difference is that I'm now targeting the end of October and the first week of November. This is the peak cruising time in my area. It's when I see the most mature bucks on their feet during daylight. And what I love to do more than anything else as a hunter is to hunt on the ground. I love to still hunt, and I love to set up in natural blinds. I don't own a blind that you can set up, but I am on the ground probably 70% of the time. And the reason that I like to do that is, one, there's just nothing like beating a buck when you're on the same level as it. And two, I feel, at least in part, it evens the game a little bit. If I can beat a buck when I'm on the same level as it, there's a certain level of accomplishment that you feel when that happens. And it's not for everybody, but I love it. And part of it is probably that I like to move. I don't like sitting for long periods of time, although I can sit for an entire day in a tree stand if that's the best tactic to get a buck. But I love moving. And what I would do is I'd come in here. I've had really good success with this. In fact, last year, incredible success with this. Come into this spot. I will take off anything that I have with me. I usually carry a really small pack. In this scenario, I wouldn't even have a tree stand with me. And so I've got minimal stuff. Take off the stuff just back here, 15, 20 yards back the trail in this soft edge area. And then I come up here either with my rattling antlers or an estrus bleat or a grunt tube where I would make the sounds of a buck tending a doe. And what I'm trying to do is to entice either the buck that's in this mature buck bed or any of these adjacent beds that I know about, or for that matter, They could be anywhere during that period of time to come in and see what's going on. And what is key to this is I stay just out in the transition. I don't want to go in to the actual hemlock area. I'm out here in the soft edge area where there's lots of dogwoods and cattails and things like that growing. There's a spot here. It goes and it follows the island. There's a spot here where you can walk in water. If you don't have boots on, you'll get wet feet. It's not deep, but it is ideal. There are some cattails growing right up against the island. And this makes it possible for me to have a quick rattling sequence. And when I say quick, I mean probably 10 or 15 seconds. Or to make maybe 2 estrus bleats. Or to make just 3 or 4 tending grunts of a buck with my grunt tube. And then I shift myself right to about here. There is an opening to be able to shoot in through the island. So if this buck gets up, let me change my color here. If this buck gets up out of this bed and comes up here to check it out, normally what he will do is he'll go like this. He'll come downwind of it because he wants to scent check before he gets there. And that would be no good because he would be able to smell my scent, plus he crosses my trail that I came in on. But what I've noticed during this time frame, you know, the end of October, the beginning of November, the big bucks lose their caution and they come right into the spot. And as he's coming in and, you know, he's bristling his ears back and his neck hair is standing on end and he's strutting in, he'll turn broadside usually. And I've got an easy shot. It is high risk, but incredibly high reward. Last year I had a situation where I saw a mature 10-point, good mass, really nice length on the tines, a really good quality deer. Saw him working a scrape. I grabbed my bow and I walked 70 yards. I stopped. I grunted 3 times. And then I moved 30 yards to my left. And he came in like he was on a string to 20 yards away. I already had my bow pulled back. And unfortunately, I didn't know at the time that my bow was actually broken. And I shot high. I connected with the buck. Fortunately, there was only about 1 inch of penetration with my arrow. And it missed the spinal cord and also the vitals, kind of in between the two of them. And I found 11 drops of blood. I looked for him for about 4 hours, and the way that he ran, I was quite confident that he survived that shot. So I know that this works. I also had a scenario happen a couple of years ago, identical to that, only it was different property, and the buck actually came into 8 yards and stood for about 7 or 8 minutes, and I couldn't get a shot, and that's another story to tell sometime. But I know that this works. Again, you have to be ready. You have got to have your arrow ready to go. Your release needs to be ready to go. You need to expect that that buck will respond almost instantly, and he can come in on a hurry. And if you're not ready, you can almost get mowed over. So, but man, it's an exciting thing. So if you love adrenaline and you love to be on the ground, that's one tactic that you can use. And then the third example is actually more general. It's not precisely for this buck bed, but it's more catering to the fact that I know that what's happening on the island is being replicated out here in this soft edge. Again, come in from the east, and there's a spot here. This tree right here is a willow tree. I love to hunt from willow trees, in part because I usually only need about 1 step to be able to get into the tree itself, and a lot of times that's enough because I can actually get into the crook of the tree. I can tie my safety harness in and be 6 to 12 feet up off the ground and have a really good view of what's going on. Just so happens, and this is often the case when you have a willow tree because they're so large and there's often not a lot of vegetation beneath it, that this area right in here is somewhat more open compared to the rest of this soft edge. And it opens up the possibility of catching a cruising buck coming down this trail or any internal trail that's here. I emphasize this main trail because I know about it because I see it on my trail cam. I know there are other trails that go through these soft edges on the sides. So I set up in this spot right here, and this really could work at any time during the main part of the rut. So October 20th till November 15th, maybe. Maybe even you could go in later, and you could certainly come in here, you know, the does or the fawns that don't get bred. Then when they cycle back into estrus about a month later in the middle of December or so, this would be a good spot to do that in. Or even in January. Each successive mating time where the bulk of the does are in heat, you know, around November 15th is the first one for us, and then December 15th, the second one, and January 15th, the third one. They get smaller and smaller and there's less movement, but there's still action. And so this could be a potential spot for any of those times. I don't think it's a real good quality early season spot. If I were going to hunt this spot in early season, I would probably be more over here in these trees, hoping that a buck comes up off this finger and starts moving. Most likely he's going to go to the west to the ag, but a lot of times they just mill around because they know they can't go out into the open. And so they'll eat the red brush, dogwood, just browse on the stuff that they like. There's plenty of food for them in the swamp. And then I would be hunting, you know, this finger movement coming up out of the finger. I didn't mention this yet, and I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't mention this. While I've drawn in these streams, and that's what you can see from the air, this spot in here is a lot of floating bog type of stuff. The deer don't even like to cross in this area. I don't know that I've ever seen a deer in this area. And so that's one of the nice things that really makes this a pinch point and a good place for deer to cross, and you can see that by the trails that are there. So that's kind of a rundown of how I go about hunting this particular buck bed. I do want to say that I would like to do some videos of how to hunt private land. And I only do private land because I don't want to put public land examples out there. Depending on the state, there's only so much public land, and you know, it's pretty easy. I'm blown away how quickly people can pick up on, you know, video footage and going, oh, I know where that is, or an aerial that looks, you know, they know where it is, and it doesn't take very much pressure to make a really hot hunting spot completely cold and useless. So if you have private land and you would like to know how to best go about hunting those private tracts, and I want to be able to confirm that it's private land, so you'll need to contact me via email or through my website or on Facebook, and I'll put links for those in the description. If you would like me to, you know, consider doing your private property and saying how I would go about hunting it and certain times of the year when it may be good, feel free to contact me. I'd like to start making a couple of videos for private land as well. So if you have any questions, please post them below. I love interacting with all of you. Really appreciate all that you've done to help the channel grow and to, you know, the support that you share. I love the deer hunting community. All right, until next time, I'm Daryl with Seeds to Dreams Deer, and I hope you find more than you think that you're hunting for. It won't be long. We'll be out in the woods the swamps, the river bottoms, chasing them. Take care.